pursuit of truth in any era has always been messy. It is rarely a straightforward transaction. It involves accusation, suspicion, and the volatile chemistry of fear. But for the medieval world, extracting the truth was not merely a matter of questioning. It was an industrial process, a bureaucratic nightmare requiring both legal mandate and considerable amounts of specialized equipment. Forget the romance of chivalry or the grandeur of faith. Beneath these trappings lay a profoundly cynical system built on coercion and paperwork. This chapter begins with the premise that sometimes mere words are insufficient. When testimony fails to materialize, when the suspect remains steadfast in their lie, or perhaps worse, when they remain stubbornly silent, the legal mechanism shifts from polite inquiry to something far more invasive. It transitions from an investigation into knowledge to a study of physical endurance. In modern jurisprudence, we might view such scenarios as indicators for better evidence collection or even psychological profiles. In the 14th century, however, the system viewed it differently. Silence was not neutrality, it was deceit. Refusal to cooperate suggested complicity with sedition, heresy, or treason, crimes against the divinely ordained order of society. The body, therefore, ceased to be merely a biological entity under duress. It became an interrogative instrument, a living text waiting for translation through pain. This realization is perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval legal practice. The assumption that suffering itself could unlock cognitive secrets. The pre-pain phase, what history might term the art of false testimony, was therefore less about finding evidence and more about constructing the asterisk conditions asterisk for inevitable confession. The sheer infrastructure surrounding this process speaks volumes about its deeply ingrained societal acceptance. It wasn't a black market hobby. It required notarization, specialized legal advisors, and an understanding of forensic anatomy. A conviction demanded not just belief from the court, but irrefutable procedural compliance, turning torture into a highly regulated commodity. Consider the roles within this terrifying bureaucracy. You had the inquisitors, the moral arbiters who possessed authority drawn from religious law. Then there were the secular magistrates, representing civil power and the stability of the realm. Each group maintained their own manuals of procedure, each defining proper interrogation in wildly divergent ways. To say that torture was standardized across Europe is a radical understatement. It was instead localized, adaptable, and infinitely bureaucratic. The process was structured to appear just, even when the physical outcome was utterly barbaric. Forms were filled out documenting everything: the accusation, the initial level of resistance, the recommended duration of questioning, and crucially, the list of necessary implements. The preparation for pain began with deep psychological groundwork. This wasn't merely physical beating. It involved sensory manipulation designed to induce cognitive collapse. The accused was systematically stripped of their status, their autonomy, and their sense of temporal continuity. They were moved from one room, one type of questioning, and often one physical orientation, creating a disorienting state that eroded the individual self before any device was even attached. And so we arrive at the concept of diagnostic pain. This terminology itself is deeply disturbing, suggesting that agony functions as a medical tool, a way to test for an invisible malady. The truth: the body was seen as malfunctioning in its ability to withhold information, and painful stimulus was deployed until the system corrected itself by admitting guilt. It implies that integrity itself is a physical defect requiring correction through suffering. The paperwork associated with this enterprise is staggering to contemplate. Legal treatises from various jurisdictions detail not just how *1 might apply pain, but at what points in the process certain psychological breakthroughs were expected. If the initial level of coercive interrogation failed, if the diagnostic phase remained inconclusive, the law provided escalation protocols. These protocols ensured that the investigator never had to admit failure. They only needed to prove that a higher degree of coercion was legally necessary for achieving justice. This entire framework reveals less about medieval ideals of justice and more about an institutional comfort with absolute, measurable control. The legal concept of double jeopardy did not extend to suffering in the way we understand it. If a confession could be extracted under duress, that confession held immense weight, often outweighing contradictory testimony from witnesses or circumstantial evidence entirely. This created a terrible incentive structure. Those who maintained resistance were functionally creating more evidence for their own condemnation. The initial stage of this horrifying ballet was therefore one of establishing complete legal certainty before the physical arts even began. It was an exhausting, intellectually grueling exercise in making the suspect feel guilty long before they experienced any actual injury. The art required masterful psychological timing. An investigator needed to gauge the precise moment when a subject's will would break, not through overwhelming force, but through accumulated fatigue and existential dread. They had to maintain a veneer of meticulous professionalism while presiding over what was fundamentally an act of extreme interpersonal cruelty. It required a specialized form of emotional detachment, almost theatrical in its performance. The room itself became the stage, the interrogator the director, and suffering the primary art form. This deep-seated cultural acceptance of coercive procedure is key to understanding why such devices persisted for so long. Because the legal system had successfully ritualized atrocity, transforming necessary evil into professional, even bureaucratic, best practice before we even consider the agonizing snap of a limb or the searing bite of metal. We must understand that medieval torture was not merely chaotic brutality. It was an industry, a field requiring specialized knowledge, complex inventories of hardware, and most importantly, a deep understanding of applied leverage. Our previous explorations established that the quest for truth was often more concerned with bureaucracy than justice. It required forms, stamps, and professional accreditation. To understand how pain became systematized, you must look at the engineering behind it. These devices were not relics plucked from history's trash heap. They were marvels of misguided Renaissance ingenuity. They operated on principles far beyond simple knots and rope. They demanded understanding mechanics, tension, fulcrum points, counterweight, and directional stress. Consider the sheer logistics. A professional torturer was less a monster in the Gothic novel and more an advanced technician. He required materials science expertise to know which wood would withstand prolonged torsion, which metal alloy would maintain its shape under extreme heat, and how far one could stretch organic material before irreversible failure occurred. These were contraptions that treated human anatomy not as something sacred, but as a series of measurable tensile strengths. If the legal framework was the recipe, these devices were the specialized, often highly flammable kitchen equipment. Each piece had a name, and usually a precise manual entry detailing its optimal deployment and maximum endurance. They moved beyond simple infliction. They sought specific results: disorientation, confession through structural failure, or simply utter psychological breakdown achieved by managing pain in measurable increments. Imagine these devices assembled in underground workrooms, not just dungeons, but workshops humming with the sounds of whittling wood and filing metal. Here, master craftsmen meticulously calibrated their instruments. They weren't building torture for sport. They were engineering diagnostic tools meant to measure the elasticity of a person's commitment to lies. The sophistication required was staggering. We are talking about machines that incorporated levers acting on joints, systems utilizing continuous tension applied over extended periods, and sometimes even pneumatic or counterweighted elements designed not just to break bone instantly, but to guide it toward eventual structural failure through gradual, sustained effort. Think of the mechanics involved in a device like the small-scale traction system. It didn't need massive blocks. Often, smaller screws or highly refined levers applied localized force at predictable points: the wrists, the ankles, the outer joints of the knee. The pain was not solely acute. It was meticulously controlled, building to an agonizing crescendo that felt always just out of reach. This prolonged tension was engineered to achieve a state of sustained suffering where critical thought dissolved, leaving only raw need. These devices represented humanity's early foray into applied biomechanics fueled by existential dread. They treated the body as a joint system, susceptible to predictable stress points. The genius and the horror lay in their intersection, scientific understanding serving pure punitive ends. The more refined the engineering, the less random the suffering became. It was procedural, almost clinical. They necessitated a class of specialized practitioners who understood how much pain an average peasant could endure versus what an educated noble might withstand, based on cultural norms and legal statutes. Torture was thus elevated from primal revenge to state-sanctioned industrial process. It had operational guidelines, maintenance schedules for the metal fittings, and specific protocols for reporting optimal yield. This level of bureaucracy attached to agony is perhaps its most deeply disturbing feature. The resulting engineering was a dark ballet of misguided ingenuity. When you look at these contraptions, the various versions of screw presses, levering jacks, or traction systems, you are not just seeing instruments of cruelty. You are viewing the terrifying heights of human conceptualization applied to suffering itself. They were mechanisms designed to stretch truth into submission, one agonizing calculation at a time. If Chapter 1 showed us the suspicion that precedes pain, and Chapter 2 demonstrated the impressive mechanical means by which that pain could be applied, then Chapter 3 shows us the rulebook. We are entering the shockingly mundane world of medieval judicial administration. The art of agony, it turns out, was not merely a savage impulse. It was a highly regulated industry, complete with guidelines, required paperwork, and regional variations in best practices. It was bureaucracy elevated to an instrument of supreme suffering. To understand this system is to realize that torture required more than malice. It demanded meticulous professionalism. You needed people who understood law codes, jurisdictional disputes, and most critically, the optimal calibration of agony. These were not amateur, nighttime ravings. The state had formalized the interrogation process into a predictable sequence of steps. If you wished to break a man, you first needed to know exactly which legal statute authorized that specific breaking. Was it slander, treason against the crown, or simply suspected witchcraft? Each charge carried its own mandated pain quotient. The professionalization of cruelty is perhaps history's most uncomfortable truth. The executioner, for example, was not merely a brute. He was often a skilled artisan and quasi-engineer. He had to know how much tension a femur could bear before it snapped cleanly, or at what angle the thumb screws should be applied to maximize discomfort without instantly killing the subject, a subtlety that suggests an appalling degree of anatomical knowledge. Furthermore, these methods were codified in legal manuals. Think of them as highly detailed instruction guides for human suffering, passed down through guilds and academic centers. Regional variation was rampant and fascinatingly specific. The rules governing interrogation in Milan could be drastically different from those written in London, or even across the Channel to the French courts. A man suspected of a minor infraction might face the subtle, drawn-out torment mandated by Italian law, perhaps involving oil and heated instruments for controlled laceration. Meanwhile, his equivalent accusation in England might subject him to a much more public, legally sanctioned beating utilizing standardized cudgels. The legal system demanded that suffering be predictable, systematic, and above all, justifiable on parchment. The goal was not simply pain. The goal was legal confession. A confession extracted via agony had to withstand scrutiny when it arrived in court, meaning the process itself needed a clear lineage of authorization. This created an entire class of specialized torturers, individuals who were less detective and more high-tech compliance officers, whose primary skill was following procedure while ensuring maximum physical stress. The documentation surrounding these procedures is staggering, giving us a terrifying glimpse into institutionalized sadism. We see detailed descriptions outlining the ideal length of time for various applications. Some manuals might advise that a proper beating should last no less than an hour to adequately shock the system, but not so long as to prevent vital interrogation later. The required tools were also itemized. Which specific type of iron was needed for branding? What standardized measurement of rope tension applied to which joint? This level of bureaucratic detail transforms us from observers of simple brutality into analysts of perverse civil engineering. Torture becomes a problem in logistical management. Who signs the warrant? What materials are required? How many attendants are necessary to maintain procedural integrity and document the suffering accurately? It was an enterprise that demanded budgets, legal vetting, and skilled manual labor, and we must also consider the role of the contract. In some periods, professional executioners or torturers were essentially highly paid contractors, operating within a framework of legalized violence. Their livelihood depended not just on their strength, but on their adherence to regional procedural standards. They had reputation stakes. Failure to follow the correct protocol meant losing their bread and butter. This economic incentive ensured that even the act of torture retained a veneer of quasi-academic rigor, turning human agony into a service rendered under strict contract law. This standardization, while horrific, is what makes it so unsettlingly modern. It suggests a society capable of organizing suffering, of treating the body not as an individual to be saved or even killed, but as a complex, measurable instrument whose failure points could be cataloged and exploited for the ultimate commodity, truth. The parchment trail of agony is perhaps the most disturbing artifact of all. It tells us that at its peak, cruelty was not a frenzy of passion. It was cold, calculated administration. If the law is a delicate mechanism built upon oaths and shaky parchment, then the rack was the instrument designed to pull that entire fragile structure apart. It wasn't just torture. It was highly engineered jurisprudence. We have spent chapters examining the intellectual scaffolding of agony, the paperwork, the specialized knowledge of leverage, the bureaucratic acceptance that suffering was simply an investigative tool. Now we enter the rack room, a space where abstract legal principles were translated into horrifying physical reality. Forget any sanitized notion of quick pain. This process was designed for maximal psychological degradation, measured in slow, agonizing degrees of tension. The rack itself was deceptively simple. At its core, it was a wooden frame capable of suspending the victim and applying immense, controlled force along two opposing axes. But to call it merely a stretcher is to dismiss its true genius and its profound terror. It transformed the human body into an adjustable lever system for the edification of the state. The goal wasn't necessarily breaking bone outright. In fact, simply snapping bones was often too quick, too crude, and failed to yield the desired narrative confession. The objective was a slow-motion dismantling of physical integrity, systematic stretching, until the point of structural failure, the precise moment where the mind finally surrendered its guard. The process began with methodical preparation. Straps were secured, not just around the limbs, but seemingly into the sinews themselves. These restraints anchored the body to the device, creating an immediate sense of helplessness and absolute vulnerability. The psychological stage was set long before the mechanism moved. The accused knew what was coming. They understood that the law had deemed them guilty enough, or at least useful enough, for this specific ordeal. This precognizance added a layer of dread far more profound than simple pain. Then came the application of force. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, ropes were turned upon the axle. The tension began to build, not in a sudden jerk that breaks instantly, but in a gradual, relentless accumulation, a steadily climbing pressure that forced every joint, ligament, and tendon into an unprecedented state of strain. Imagine the weight on your shoulders, gradually pulled back, forcing unnatural arching. Imagine your wrists being drawn until the smooth rotation of the carpal bones was replaced by screaming resistance, or your ankles dragged wide enough to feel like they might separate from your very self. It was a biomechanical deconstruction, turning living flesh into an abstract problem of tension and physics. The medieval torturer, in this sense, was not merely a brute force operative. He was an advanced field technician. He required knowledge of anatomy where the joints were weakest, which ligaments would snap first under specific forces, and how to maintain maximum pain threshold without causing immediate incapacitation. This elevated the act from mere sadism to a horrifyingly specialized craft. The torturer wasn't guessing. He was calibrating his cruelty, treating the victim like a faulty machine whose operating manual needed correcting through extreme stress testing. The true horror of the rack, however, lay not just in the breaking points, but in the exquisite patience required to push the body past its comfort zone and into an intolerable realm. Prolonged tension creates a unique type of agony, a deep, visceral ache that speaks to the very core of what it means to be connected. It is the feeling of being stretched thin across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The pain was so pervasive, so evenly distributed across major muscle groups, that individual sources of suffering became meaningless. There was only the totality of strain. And then came the psychological toll. Because the process was slow and deliberately controlled, it provided ample opportunity for mental breakdown. As the physical screaming faded into ragged gasping, the mind began to reel under the relentless stress. The captive experienced temporal confusion. Minutes could feel like decades, each small turn of the winch seeming infinite in its duration. They were forced to confront not only the pain, but the sheer emptiness and meaninglessness of their situation. All resistance was futile against an established legal process and a slowly turning wheel. This method fundamentally exploited the law's demand for narrative truth. If the state claimed that the accused had withheld information, the rack served as the ultimate prompt, a physical mechanism forcing involuntary compliance. Confessions extracted this way were not necessarily revelations of deep-seated guilt. They were often products of chemically induced delirium and pure musculoskeletal desperation. The truth was simply what the body could no longer physically sustain itself resisting. The brilliance, if you can call it that, lay in its bureaucratic integration. There were protocols for how many turns were permissible, when a break constituted reaching peak yield, and precisely who held the legal authority to adjust the ratchet at any given moment. It suggests not only a belief in torture's efficacy, but an industrial commitment to its documentation. The instruments were record-keeping devices as much as they were pain dispensers. Every turn added weight to the official ledger of state power. The culmination of this systematic agony was always the fragile, compromised confession, a document signed under duress that nevertheless held legal weight, effectively binding a suspect's soul, or at least their physical cooperation, to the machinery of justice. It concluded not with death or freedom, but often with exhaustion and the terrifying residue of enforced compliance. The rack thus stands as perhaps the quintessential monument to misplaced human ingenuity, a sophisticated piece of mechanical engineering designed solely to stretch truth out of suffering flesh, proving that in the medieval imagination, advanced science and profound cruelty were merely two sides of the same deeply uncomfortable coin. The resulting agony wasn't just physical. It was an epistemological one, forcing man to literally prove his reality through unbearable tensile stress. If the rack was about tearing apart a body to extract truth through tensile force, and the preceding chapters detailed the systematized dismantling of anatomy, then here we find methods that aimed for something far more insidious: sensory warfare. This chapter moves past the satisfying snap of bone or the taut groan of strained ligaments. We are now in the realm of pure, localized neurological agony. We are dealing with devices designed not to break you open, but to confuse your nervous system into submission. The premise remains familiar: the desperate need for confession, the societal demand for justice. But the methodology has achieved a terrifying degree of refinement. The torturer is no longer merely an advanced technician. They have become a highly specialized pain architect. Their goal is not brute force, but calibrated discomfort that forces the mind to manufacture answers simply to cease the input. Consider devices centered on sensory overload and deprivation, a disturbing combination in any context, let alone the crucible of medieval interrogation. These contraptions understood that sometimes the greatest torment was not what you could physically withstand, but what your brain could process. The body might survive a week of raking iron, but prolonged exposure to paradoxical stimuli can unmake the self. We delve into the horrifying specifics of instruments designed purely for localized pain and discomfort. Think less of large mechanical levers and more of highly focused implements: pincers, specialized clamps, adjustable rods meant to apply pinpoint pressure against specific nerve clusters. These were not merely placeholders. They were extensions of a terrifyingly precise understanding of human anatomy that treated nerves like electrical wires, ripe for misfiring. One prime example involves the meticulous torment of extremities and digits. The hands and fingers, symbols of capability, skill, and daily life, became canvases for suffering. We examine implements designed to restrict circulation, the subtle application of pressure points, or the gradual tightening until the nerves screamed their protest. It was a method of torture so precise that it bordered on surgery, achieving excruciating results with minimal visible damage at first. The sensory torment extended far beyond mere physical clamping. Imagine localized heat and cold application, administered not randomly, but in complex, oscillating patterns across skin or muscle. The brain struggles desperately to interpret these conflicting inputs. Is this burning or numbing? Is the pain receding or intensifying? This forced confusion destabilized a person's grip on reality, making them vulnerable to suggestion. Then there were devices of mechanical sensory deprivation, not merely binding, but specialized restraints that manipulated perception itself. By restricting minute movements, the flexing of toes, the subtle twitching of eyelids, the interrogators achieved a state of hyper-awareness mixed with helplessness. The prisoner was kept acutely conscious, unable to escape or even properly rest, creating an internal psychological vacuum. Brilliance and the horror of this phase is its integration into established legal procedures. This was not rogue cruelty, it followed protocols. Legal manuals detailed appropriate levels of sensory assault, which nerves were deemed sufficiently sensitive for a certain level of accused treachery. What duration of discomfort constituted adequate pressure without crossing the line into accidental fatality, a risk that could invalidate the entire confession and subsequent trial? The torturer, in this highly specialized context, was operating as a sort of human machine calibrator. They required knowledge not just of anatomy, but of psychophysiology, or at least what passingly resembled such a discipline. They were measuring the elasticity of the human spirit against the measured resistance of physical endurance. This forensic application of pain culminated in what we might darkly call confessional engineering. The goal was to push the subject beyond mere agony and into cognitive exhaustion. When the body is screaming through overload and the senses are fighting conflicting signals, the mind resorts to the path of least resistance, and that path leads directly to confirming whatever story the authority figures require. The implications of these specialized devices are profoundly unsettling because they challenge our modern understanding of pain and consent. They reveal a time when suffering was not just endured, but scientifically utilized as an input variable in a deeply complex social equation. The confession became the output. Agony was simply the processing power required to achieve it. It transforms the narrative from simple brutality into something far colder, a kind of state-sponsored psychological extraction service. These localized assaults mark a pivotal moment in the history of systemic cruelty, when punishment evolved from general overkill to hyper-specific, calibrated discomfort. The body ceased being viewed simply as flesh and bone. It became a collection of measurable, manipulable systems: nerves, tendons, sensory receptors, each point a potential lever for the state's inscrutable demands. If the previous chapters charted the physical boundaries of human agony, the measurable snap of a bone, the controlled strain on a tendon, then we now move into a far more insidious territory: the architecture of the mind, the meticulous, terrifying business of breaking the spirit itself. We have explored methods that broke bodies. The Inquisition's Playbook was designed to break belief. This was not an exercise in biomechanics, but in profound psychological entropy. The inquisitorial process required truth above all else, and a truthful confession was one born not of pain's sudden shock, but of relentless, orchestrated mental exhaustion. It demanded a level of subtle cruelty that transformed the physical torturer into a highly skilled interrogator, a master psychologist armed with institutional terror. The goal shifted from extracting a bone-breaking truth to cultivating a suggestionable, compliant narrative. Consider the environment itself. The holding cell was not merely a cage. It was a psychological vacuum designed to isolate the accused completely from reality. Time became the primary instrument of torture. By disrupting sleep cycles, by imposing unrelenting uncertainty regarding fate or duration, interrogators were able to dismantle the victim's internal sense of order. This technique, surprisingly sophisticated in its simplicity, leveraged sheer temporal deprivation. The horror was not what happened. It was the agonizing inability to know when it would stop. The accuser and the interrogated became locked in a brutal dance of cognitive warfare. They debated facts that could only exist within the confines of suffering, weaving threads of doubt into the very fabric of reality. Was the accused being questioned about heresy? Or were they simply rambling because their nerves had been frayed thin enough to snap? The line blurred until it ceased to matter, leaving only a desperate need for resolution, even if that resolution was a lie. Sometimes, the playbook turned toward techniques that bypassed pain entirely in favor of sheer terror. These methods focused on sensory manipulation. Through carefully calibrated lights and sound, a monotonous chanting, repetitive rhythms, or sudden, blinding flashes, the interrogator aimed to overload the nervous system until critical function degraded. The victim's mind was pushed into a state of heightened confusion, making them receptive not just to questions, but to suggestion itself. This wasn't physical stress, it was psychic saturation. There were also methods designed to simulate profound loss of control. Imagine periods of induced disorientation where the accused might be led on phantom journeys or subjected to mock trials that spiraled into meaningless complexity. The terror stemmed from not understanding the rules of their confinement. Were they being tried for crimes against man, or for failure to remember a date? By introducing these layers of intellectual confusion, the Inquisition effectively controlled the parameters of reality for its victims. The most chilling realization is how institutionalized this process was. It required record keeping. There were internal memoranda detailing optimum levels of psychological pressure. Experts discussed not merely which confession was desired, but which methods offered the highest probability of extracting that specific narrative while maintaining legal defensibility. Torture became a metric, a quantifiable procedure in a ledger book, a horrifying bureaucratic necessity. The goal was never simply to inflict suffering for its own sake. It was to produce a legally actionable piece of testimony packaged with enough institutional authority to withstand judicial scrutiny. The confession had to feel inevitable, even if the process leading up to it was pure madness. It was compelled consensus under extreme duress, and where physical devices failed because they left clear evidence, a broken tibia, a burn mark, a legible groove, psychological torture leaves only residue, confusion, paranoia, and the subtle, corrosive stain of doubt. The damage is invisible yet permanent. This playbook allowed the authorities to maintain an absolute distance between the legal system and brute savagery. They could claim that every word uttered came from the victim's own, wrung out by the crushing weight of inexplicable dread. It was the ultimate evasion, forcing confession not through force applied asterisk to asterisk the body, but into the crumbling walls of the self. It is a grim reminder that the most terrifying cages are those built for the mind, structures made of time, doubt, and unrelenting expectation. These devices were less about leverage points and more about vulnerability points. The need for sleep, the fear of being misunderstood, the deep human craving for narrative closure. The Inquisition perfected not just interrogation, but the systematic manufacturing of guilt. If the systematic agony of the core European manuals revealed a degree of terrifying efficiency, what happens when you zoom out? When you lift your gaze from the carefully codified legal procedures of Milan or London and simply observe the astonishing sheer variability of human cruelty across time and geography. This is where history becomes less about refined bureaucracy and more about regional riff-raff, a dazzling, bewildering collection of profoundly weird devices. Forget the universal truth seekers. Sometimes the localized genius was pure madness. The sheer efficiency of medieval torture, as we have documented, is a terrifying testament to human organization. It was not merely brute savagery. It was an industrially managed process, a field that combined sophisticated mechanics with the chilling detachment of bureaucratic paperwork. Yet, history has a way of presenting us with exceptions, moments when even the most meticulously calibrated system can falter spectacularly. This brings us to the inevitable question: what happens when the perfect machine encounters reality? What happens when the highly professionalized agony backfires? Chapter 8 focuses on failure. The historical record is replete with instances where the elaborate theater of pain yielded precisely nothing but madness, or worse. It protected the guiltiest offenders by creating a mountain of legal ambiguity. We are exploring the moments when the system stalled, suggesting that even the most sophisticated apparatuses of state-sanctioned suffering have intrinsic limits. The theory underpinning these devices was simple. Enough calibrated pain would produce an inconvenient truth, the necessary confession required to close a file. and satisfy a jurisdiction's legal curiosity. The process assumed a linear relationship between suffering and disclosure. It did not account for the unpredictable nature of the human spirit or the variable element of sheer, stubborn defiance. The initial failure mode was often biological. We expected broken bones, yes, but we also anticipated psychological collapse, leading to the verbal confession. Sometimes, however, the body simply refused to cooperate with the process. An individual might endure the precise strain applied by a calibrated lever without yielding a single word of incriminating truth, merely screaming until their vocal cords were damaged, thus rendering them permanently incapable of confiding anything useful. Consider the technical shortcomings as well. The records sometimes hint at torturers who over-engineered their misery. A mechanical contraption designed to induce excruciating peripheral nerve damage might prove so complex, requiring such specialized maintenance and understanding of biological resistance that a minor malfunction would halt the entire operation. Imagine a high-leverage machine built by Renaissance engineers, capable of applying incremental strain to every joint, yet it seizes up because a single pin was cross-threaded, or an anchor point gave way due to poor regional stonework. The very ingenuity meant to enforce truth could become its Achilles heel. Furthermore, the accused sometimes proved unexpectedly resilient. Our understanding often favors the victim as passive, a vessel simply awaiting extraction. But historical legal records reveal subjects who were not merely enduring pain. They were active participants in a grotesque negotiation of reality. They employed forms of psychological resistance that defeated the state's best-laid plans. This wasn't mere defiance. It was sophisticated, strategic withdrawal. By refusing to enter the mental space required for confession, by arguing the metaphysical ambiguity of their accusers, or by simply maintaining absolute silence despite unbearable torment, they effectively stalled the bureaucracy of agony. This refusal threw the entire legal procedure into turmoil. Confession, in this context, was not a matter of pure spiritual repentance. It was a bureaucratic prerequisite for justice, a key that opened the final judgment lock. If no confession materialized, the case could not move forward under established protocols, leading to legal paralysis and immense institutional embarrassment. The failures were often highlighted by clever loopholes within the law itself, revealing cracks in the system's otherwise rigid facade. There were jurisdictions where the right of appeal was disproportionately strong before physical torture began, or procedural safeguards that mandated specific forms of proof that torturers could circumvent with mere theatrical flourish. These weren't grand moments of heroic escape. They were tedious, detail-oriented legal victories, achieved by simply demanding more paperwork an ironic reversal where bureaucracy itself became a shield. The concept of negative confession emerged from these failures. It was the realization that sometimes the most effective way to achieve justice was not through extracting truth, but through proving its complete absence. The failure of the torture procedure thus functioned as a counter-narrative to the initial accusation. A case built on perfect technical execution could collapse entirely if the final testimony remained ambiguous or non-existent. And this highlights the philosophical limit of institutional violence. Torture is an incredibly powerful, yet ultimately limited technology. It operates under the assumption that pain equals truth. But human consciousness and culture introduce variables, resilience, legal nuance, psychological defiance that no mechanical device can account for. When the science of agony met the stubborn unpredictability of humanity, the systems designed to control both were rendered temporarily impotent. The enduring takeaway from these failed experiments is not merely a condemnation of torture itself, but an understanding of how easily even our most powerful and complex institutional mechanisms rely on flawed assumptions. It suggests that the ultimate bulwark against state overreach, the thing no rack or clamping device could break, was often simply meticulous legal argument, stubborn silence, and the refusal to treat pain as equivalent to knowledge. It provides a grim form of historical self-reflection. The devices were triumphs of engineering. The spirit was a counterforce that sometimes proved superior to mechanics. They served as stark reminders that while man may build complex machines for cruelty, he cannot engineer the will. The gears of suffering always turn toward a conclusion, and in the aftermath, what remains is rarely the simple truth. What endures are echoes, exaggerations, and entire architectural structures built from dread. We have spent time analyzing the grim mechanics, the calibrated tension of the rack, the surgical precision of nerve pincers, the cold calculation required for psychological dismantling. But history, like memory itself, does not preserve the clinical records, it preserves the story. The moment the lawman finally left the chamber and the torturer's specialized tools were hauled away, the methodical agony ceased to be a legal procedure and became something far more nebulous. Myth. The raw trauma of the experience, the sheer violation of personhood, proved too volatile for simple archival storage. It demanded dramatization. It required narrative. Consider how quickly genuine historical dread transmutes into cultural spectacle. When an act is too horrific to be documented factually, when the bureaucracy fails to adequately explain the full weight of the human degradation, the gaps are inevitably filled by imagination. The resulting narratives, marvelous in their artistry, but lethal in their inaccuracy, became the new instruments of control. We see this transformation across jurisprudence and art. Fear didn't just require physical restraint, It demanded artistic representation. Torture became a visual shorthand for moral failing. A single depiction of binding agony could convey the weight of treason or heresy to an entire populace who never had access to specialized legal manuals detailing proper regional protocol. The suffering, stripped of its academic scaffolding and professional patina, was distilled into high drama. The torturer went from being a highly paid technical expert adhering to codified protocols in Milan or London to a villainous caricature painted for pulp fiction and stage melodrama. The complexity vanished, the pure terror remained. This simplification had profound legal consequences. By turning state-sanctioned procedure into popular folklore, it simultaneously elevated the perceived stakes of those procedures while undermining their actual legitimacy. When the common citizen saw pictures or heard tales, often embellished by vengeful survivors seeking witnesses of unimaginable pain, they internalized a singular definition of justice: maximum suffering for minimum explanation. The memory, therefore, functions as both an archive and a distorting lens. It takes the specific records concerning negative confession or oscillating heat application and replaces them with sweeping gestures of inescapable doom. The nuanced distinction between diagnostic pain treated as scientific data, and simple vengeance dissolves into indistinguishable dread. The physical remnants of these torturous methods are almost impossible to trace in a purely historical sense. They were temporary, designed for an immediate, finite purpose: the extraction of a confession before the legal window closed. But their idea persisted, clinging stubbornly to cultural consciousness. This sustained power was most evident in the rise of the macabre genre itself. The very tools, the question of leverage points, the concept of applied stress leading to failure, became motifs for later storytelling, long after the actual legal necessity for such contraptions had waned. The rack did not simply fall out of use. It became a literary trope, perpetually ready for reenactment in narrative form. What is truly arresting about this historical trajectory is the detachment involved. We are looking at systems built on an acute knowledge of anatomy and psychophysiology, requiring a highly specialized skill set to maximize discomfort while adhering to legal constraints. This was not random sadism. It was high-functioning institutional cruelty, backed by paperwork. The greatest enduring myth, however, is the idea that these devices were universal in their application, or even their efficacy. The reality, as we have seen, was marked by professional failure, mechanical malfunction, and sometimes surprisingly effective defiance of the human will itself. Yet, when these complex processes meet the simple retelling power of a story, a campfire tale, a popular painting, a modern blockbuster film, the systemic failures are forgotten. The sophistication is reduced to spectacle. The legal protocols, become merely Gothic backdrop details. The cautionary element here lies in recognizing this transition, the movement from regulated state violence to unregulated cultural representation. When we consume these tales, we are not engaging with history, we are engaging with myth-making machinery. We are confronted by a dramatic simplification of deeply complex institutions. Ultimately, the aftermath teaches us that fear is inherently generative. It produces narratives where truth and exaggeration blur completely, where the subtle nuances of legal jurisdiction give way to visceral, immediate spectacle. The devices themselves were merely props in the enduring play of human judgment, a play whose script has been endlessly rewritten by survival, terror, and the irresistible need for a good story. And that is why the image of calibrated agony remains so profoundly potent, even centuries later, detached from any credible legal mechanism. We have spent this journey mapping the topography of pain, charting a disturbing course through the engineering and bureaucracy of medieval agony. We've learned that these devices, the rack, the pilaster, the instruments designed for neurolinguistic confusion, were never merely brutish tools wielded by madmen in shadowed cells. They were highly specialized technologies. They required legal scaffolding, professional expertise, and a rigorous adherence to procedural guidelines, transforming the act of torture into an industrialized, deeply bureaucratic process of state control. But as we arrive at this conclusion, we must temper the horror with a peculiar sense of historical absurdity. Why? Because the very fact that human ingenuity could be so systematically channeled into methods designed solely for maximized discomfort suggests not just barbarity, but a profound, underlying institutional need, a desperate, almost pathological craving for absolute certainty. The deepest lesson drawn from these ancient instruments is perhaps the least comforting. They were all ultimately predicated on one fragile concept, the truth. The conviction that immense physical suffering could force an inconvenient cognitive admission. That pain, whether administered by calibrated tension or through sensory starvation, was treated not as a consequence of violence, but as a diagnostic tool for the spirit. And this assumption, this fundamental belief in the punitive efficacy of agony, is what defines humanity's persistent struggle with uncertainty. And yet, if we peel back the layers of legal, manual, and mechanical complexity, what remains? We are left with something far more unsettling than the discarded chains or the rusting levers. What remains is the raw human desire to define reality through accusation, to reduce a complex disagreement, a mere ambiguity in testimony, a contradiction between two accounts, into a singular, legally marketable fact, accessible only via extreme duress. The devices themselves were merely high-tech accessories for an ancient failing, the inability of society to tolerate doubt. Doubt is inefficient. It stalls justice and disrupts the delicate balance of political power. Therefore, suspicion must be physically liquidated. The sheer scope of this systemic brutality, the detailed records detailing optimal stretching tension on a tibia, the specific protocol for heat application to maximize nerve confusion is staggering. It paints a picture not just of medieval crime, but of a sophisticated global civil service dedicated entirely to moral and legal enforcement through suffering. The torturers were functionaries. They collected forms and signed declarations as routinely as an accountant filing quarterly reports. Their goal was less about simple revenge and more about maintaining the institutional integrity of law itself. And this brings us to the comfortable, unsettling truth that these mechanisms eventually failed. As we saw when legal loopholes proved stronger than a femur, and when human defiance managed to resist both mechanical force and psychological suggestion, the system had to pivot. The moment it could no longer reliably extract confession, the legally necessary anchor for subsequent state action, it became obsolete. The disappearance of these formalized instruments of pain does not signal the end of human judgment, but merely a technological shift in its methods. The desire for ultimate control over narrative, for the ability to force an opponent into accepting one's definition of reality, remains tragically constant. It simply transitioned from the calibrated stretch of the rack to the far less visible, yet equally invasive, mechanisms of suspicion, propaganda, and systemic disbelief. The memory of these practices, the methodical dismantling of a person's physical self for the sake of documentation, is so vivid precisely because it was so structured. It had protocol. It had paperwork. It implies that evil, at its most terrifying manifestation, can be utterly mundane, governed by numbered sections and specialized vocabulary. So, what do we take away from this gruesome survey? We realize that the historical study of torture is not a moral exercise in horror. It is fundamentally an inquiry into social organization. It asks, what kind of society generates a manual detailing precise levels of pain acceptable for legal proceeding? It reveals societies where uncertainty was deemed a catastrophic existential threat, requiring total physical and psychological containment. They are cautionary tales written in bone-breaking manuals. And this leaves us with the discomforting, darkly humorous conclusion that we have explored all these complex machines, the advanced leverage systems, the psychophysiological stressors, the bureaucratic protocols of agony, and what is left? A profound fatigue, an exhaustion not of the body, but of the intellect. The overwhelming realization that perhaps the most reliable form of confession, the one least subject to legal questioning or mechanical failure, is achieved simply through utter cognitive depletion. The final lesson If we must extrapolate a piece of actionable advice from an academic study of historical atrocities, pertains not to law or ethics, but to biology. When faced with such complex systems of invasive control, the physical breaking, the sensory confusion, the temporal disorientation, the human operating system has one fail-safe mechanism: sleep. Sleep forces the collapse of the intricate bureaucratic apparatus. It demands a temporary suspension of the state's need for immediate, actionable truth. The body, recognizing the sheer inefficiency and emotional burden of unending judgment, ultimately seizes the right to silence. And perhaps that is our final, unspoken understanding regarding all these elaborate systems designed for absolute control. Every mechanism, no matter how ingenious or brutal, every lever, every written code, every expertly applied pincher, eventually succumbs to the fundamental rhythm of rest. Because in the end, nothing can withstand the simple, utterly non-bureaucratic necessity of sleep. The greatest defiance against a state dedicated to pain and certainty is simply closing one's eyes and refusing to yield. The irony, which we must savor before leaving this dark room of history, is that after chronicling centuries of sophisticated cruelty designed to break the will, all that remains as a counterforce is something utterly primitive: exhaustion, and perhaps that realization, the utter futility of institutionalizing torment against the natural human need for oblivion, is the most uncomfortable truth